If you don't know what Stoicism is, don't worry, I didn't used to have a clue either. Even in my last philosophy video, I said this. I find it kind of humorous with the never-ending self-help books that exist that still tries to answer this question today, when it was answered over 2,000 years ago by the ancient Greek word eudaimonia. I was talking about happiness and what the best practice to achieve it was. The irony of my statement is that a lot of self-help books today are based off Stoic practices, but have been rebranded to fit the modern world. So even if you're not familiar with Stoicism, there's still a good chance that you practice it even without knowing it. For example, things like journaling, meditating, practice of self-restraint are all in a way Stoic exercises. Even cognitive behavioral therapy, which some psychiatrists use to treat their patients, were developed out of the ideas of Stoicism. The difference is that CBT is used to help patients for the time they need it, while Stoicism goes beyond and is more of a way of life. So to explain what Stoicism is can sometimes be tricky because it's a wide subject with many great practices and many great philosophers. So let's begin with its origins, because to fully understand and engage with ideas, we need to understand where they came from. I think that was Socrates. I love the origin of Stoicism. Its foundation comes from its own name, which in Latin is stoa. Unlike Aristotle and Plato, who had their famous grandiose schools, stoa meant simply a painted porch. This is where the first teaching of Stoicism were held. Stoicism derives directly from cynicism. If you watch my last video on Diogenes of Sign-Up, I find it mind-boggling that a man living inside a barrel affects our lives still to this day and how we live. Stoics recognize, just like cynicism, that virtue is the only good. The main difference here is that instead of neglecting anything that isn't according to nature, Stoics recognize that some things, such as money for example, are not necessarily good or bad in themselves, but they can be used for good, or bad too for that matter. Plato and Aristotle share this view as well, and they don't count as Stoics, so let's just get into the nuances. There are many great Stoics, Epictetus being one of the most recognized, but there is no written record of his practice. But luckily for us, I think this is so cool, he had a fan that wasn't just anybody, but the Roman emperor of that time, Marcus Aurelius. Marcus frequently quotes Epictetus in his famous written word, Meditations. Epictetus described what the fundamentals of Stoicism is, which is actually very simple. It goes like this. There are things in life you can't control, and there are things that happen without our control or beyond our control. According to Epictetus, we should calmly accept when things out of our control happen. But we as individuals can, however, control our own actions through self-discipline. You've probably done this yourself at some point without the self-discipline part, when realizing that something was out of your control. Suddenly and abruptly, what has previously seemed terrible becomes unimportant. The idea of not letting things out of your control change your behavior is a simple practice that anyone can immediately grasp, but it's much, much harder to act upon. Achieving virtue is not easy. However, the length the Stoics went with this idea is often heavily criticized, misunderstood, and dismissed as being cold and apathetic. Here's an example. Xenophobe, when told about the death of his child, responded simply and calmly with, "I knew my son was immortal." You can take the extreme of this quote in any way you want, but the reality of the lesson is to simply not fight against nature and let it consume you. Focus on what you can control and let it be your virtue. Marcus Aurelius, who is known as one of the 5 good Roman emperors, did not live an easy life. He dealt with chronic pain, and his ruling as emperor would be fought against. To practice self-control, every morning Marcus would meditate. He would meditate over all the bad, horrible things and people that would oppose him that day. Here's a quote from his meditations. "When you wake up in the morning, tell yourself, the people I deal with today will be meddling, ungrateful, arrogant, dishonest, jealous, and surly. They are like this because they can't tell good from evil. But I have seen the beauty of good and the ugliness of evil, and have recognized that the wrongdoer has a nature related to my own, not of the same blood and birth, but the same mind, and possessing a share of the divine. And so none of them can hurt me. No one can implicate me in ugliness, nor can I feel angry at my relative or hate him. We were born to work together like feet, hands, and eyes, like the 2 rows of teeth, upper and lower. To obstruct each other is unnatural. To feel anger at someone, to turn your back on him, these are unnatural." Despite CBT deriving from Stoicism as previously mentioned, Stoicism itself doesn't talk much about depression. Stoicism focuses rather more on anger. They look at anger as Marcus describes as ugly and irrational. If you imagine an angry face, it's rarely a pretty one. However, it's an emotion that is often today displayed in media. When a character in a film, for example, acts in revenge, he's often seen carrying out the same bad deed that was originally done to him. But we still recognize his action as somewhat noble and satisfying. We even enjoy seeing anger if it's justified. Marcus, however, received the word one day that his close friend and general, Avidius Cassius, had betrayed him. Cassius had found out a rumor that Marcus was close to death, and possibly even dead. And so Cassius took this as an opportunity to declare himself as the new Caesar. A betrayal of this magnitude would enrage and upset anyone if it happened to us. But what Marcus did, especially for the time being, was astounding. He did nothing. He didn't want to cause panic among his people if the word got out of the betrayal and confusing of ruling. He instead acted rationally, without anger and without hatred, and made the announcement that he will march against Cassius, not to kill him, but to capture him. When a friend betrays us, we have every right to get angry. But Marcus controlled this anger. He even mentioned that he hoped Cassius would not kill himself in shame before his arrival. For Marcus' coming would be a great testimony of his virtue. Marcus managed to not just calm himself, but his people, and while doing so, he did what needed to be done, which was to secure the empire, and he succeeded. Plato long before him said that philosophers should be kings. This act of Marcus was a true testimony to that statement. A famous Stoic quote once said, "It is not possible to live well today unless you treat it as your last." Death is always near in Stoicism. Marcus meditated heavily on this theme as well. It might seem morbid, but it helps remind oneself to live in the moment. It helps you build virtue, build character, and prepare yourself to be ready to depart at any moment. Marcus would meditate every evening to remind himself to be grateful for every day. To me, this is the most powerful part of Stoicism. It's called memento mori, remember death. You might have heard it before. I used to study a fair bit of Buddhism, and what struck a chord with me was the idea of reincarnation. If you live a virtuous life, you will be rewarded in the next. But if there's no reincarnation, then you still lived a virtuous life. Marcus had the same sentiment, but put it way more eloquently. Here's another quote from his meditations. "Live a good life. If there are gods and they are just, then they will not care how devout you have been, but will welcome you based on the virtues you have lived by. If there are gods but unjust, then you should not want to worship them. If there are no gods, then you will be gone, but will have lived a noble life that will live on in the memories of the loved ones." Just like Nietzsche said, "He who has a why to live for can bear almost any how." If you have a purpose, you can live through any pain and suffering. The purpose for the Stoic is virtue, and it turns any pain on its head. That's what makes Stoicism so powerful and timeless that it's still practiced today. Memento mori, to not let it frighten you, but remind you to live life with virtue. Memento mori, by practicing Stoicism, there is no pain and suffering in this world that you can't endure. Memento mori, nothing can be taken from you, for a Stoic only values virtue. Memento mori, any suffering and pain will be an opportunity for you to display and practice your virtue. Memento mori, by living life to the fullest, you are also ready to let go at any moment, to not meet death with fear or anger, but rather welcoming because some things you just can't control. Memento mori, remember death.